And I'm also enabling the captions. For those of you who'd like to use them, you can toggle those off and on. And I will begin by introducing today's speaker. Professor Zhou is Assistant Professor of Sociology and Chinese Studies here at the University of Michigan. She's trained as a social demographer, and her work examines social inequality and state market family relations through the lens of gender, marriage, and reproduction. Her research combines survey data analysis, in-depth interviews, and agent-based computational modeling. Her published work has appeared in journals including Journal of Marriage and Family, Journal of Contemporary China, and Socius, and has received coverage in national and international news outlets. Yun earned her PhD in sociology from Harvard University in 2017 and was a postdoctoral research associate in the Population Studies and Research Center at Brown University before joining Michigan in 2019. Before she begins her presentation, I will just note that she'll have about 35 to 40 minutes for her presentation, and then we'll follow that up with questions from the audience, and we'll reserve the last 15 minutes or so for a professional development conversation at the end. Please hold your questions until the end, unless you have sort of pressing questions of clarification. With that, I will turn things over to our speaker. So thanks again, Yun, for joining us. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Paula, for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen and give me 1 second. Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I am very excited to share my work with you today. Today's talk comes from a larger project of mine that aims to intersect the studies of population and politics. The larger project examines the political, gendered, and demographic consequences of China's recent ending of the one-child policy. And today I'm going to talk about self-preference attitudes among highly educated urban Chinese women. So Asia's and China's missing daughters has captured the attention of both journalists and scholars over the past several decades. And their extensive writings have focused on China's skewed sex ratio and its human rights, political, and demographic implications. In understanding some preference, extant studies have highlighted both the economic and cultural features of the patrilineal family system. On the economic front, extensive writings have highlighted the expectations placed on sons as providers of old age support for their parents. So, for example, demographers have posited that the rise of welfare state in some European countries reduced parents' reliance on their children for old age support and shifted that dependence onto the state. And in so doing, at the same time, weakened son preference. Along the same line, extant studies highlighted also the expectations placed on sons as providers of agricultural labor. But the heightened values accorded to sons are not only economic, but cultural at the same time. Within the patrilineal system, scholars have highlighted the values accorded to men as preservers of the family lineage. So correspondingly, in recent research, they are turned to look at not only the continuity, but also the change in son preference. A line of recent research highlighted the changing cultural notions surrounding what does it mean to have daughters and what it means to be or to be part of a modern family. So, for example, scholars highlighted the changing cultural values of daughters now as the providers of the more emotional and intimate care during parents' old age. So, daughters as the little quilted vest that warms parents' heart, all that daughters as the source or the providers of the tender, loving care. So research on son preference or sex preference attitude and behavior have largely highlighted the features, both economic and cultural, of the patrilineal family system. And oftentimes, those are the features that are also at the same time rooted in the economic and social arrangement of agrarian societies. To that end, some preference is often viewed as a residual of traditional kingship system and practices. And as a result, empirical research on some preference, especially those situated in China, focus almost exclusively on rural and rural to urban migrant populations and communities. So relatively little is known about highly educated women and how their gendered lived experience encounters with gender equality or inequality, both within the patrilineal family, but also beyond, shape how they articulate their own sex preference attitudes and what are the meanings that they attach to having sons or having daughters. And I argue that this gap is significant because examining how the more advantaged and more privileged women within a patriarchal society articulate their desire for offspring sex in relation to their own gendered lived experience will shed light on the conditions under which some preference may transform or endure. So against this backdrop, in this paper, I ask, how do highly educated urban Chinese women narrate their preference for offspring sex? And specifically, I want to highlight what are the meanings these women attach to having sons vis-a-vis having daughters. And I find paradoxically an enduring preference for exclusively sons among highly educated urban Chinese women who otherwise support gender egalitarianism. And in trying to understand these seemingly paradoxical preference for sons, I found two distinct cultural logics that have eluded existing studies. First, these highly educated women, they draw on their own experience of both overt and implicit gender discriminations. That is the hardship, the gendered hardship in a woman's life in articulating their preference for offspring sex. So some preference is framed as this desire to spare their own children of experiencing similar gendered hardship. And along the same line, raising daughters are viewed as emotionally taxing hard work. So yet, I will also show that despite such a nuance in the reasoning, their preference for sons ultimately does not challenge the existing heightened values placed on sons within the patrilineal patriarchal Chinese families and hold implications and behavioral implications for second birth outcomes. So before I get to the data and the findings, I want to briefly situate some preference in contemporary China within both the empirical research and the evidence that are coming out of research on rural China. And I also want to give a little time to the general social and demographic changes and the policy context of contemporary China that frames this project. So again, existing research focusing on rural China have also tackled sex preference attitude and behavior, focused on the patrilineal family, looking from both economic and the cultural end. So on the economic front, there are a line of research that look at families' participation in voluntary pension programs, and scholars have found that the expansion of the voluntary pension program in rural China is often associated with the slower masculinization of sex ratio at birth. And it's also found that families who have sons also have smaller savings and are less likely to participate in voluntary pension programs. And on the other end, drawing on the understanding that sons are expected to provide labors. So scholars have also found the association between the size of arable land and sex ratio at birth. And also a line of research demonstrated that agricultural machinization also slowed the masculinization of sex ratio at birth. And on the cultural front, scholars highlight the practice of building ancestral halls and updating family genealogical records and individuals' preference for offspring sex. And recent studies drawing on ethnographic evidence from rural China highlight the changing meanings of daughters and what it means to be a successful family. So some recent ethnographic evidence have shown that some rural young parents are also actively embracing having smaller family, imbuing that with the meaning of having a modern family. And daughters are viewed as valuable and as providers of the more emotional and intimate care and companionship. And studies on China, looking at China's sex ratio and China's sex preference within China, often highlighted the importance of the one-child policy. And on one end, the preference for male offspring is built into the policy's design and implementation, in the sense that by the design of the policy, for rural families who have a firstborn daughters, a second child is allowed. So a huge line of body of scholarship looks at under the one-child policy, the abandonment and the human cost of some preference through looking at female infanticide, abandonment, and the neglect of female infants and girl children. But at the other end, the one-child policy, to some extent, also empowered urban-only daughters. They are now viewed as the only hope by their parents, and they no longer have to compete with male siblings for parental investment, especially parental education investment. So to some extent, in this paper, I really want to take a look at these only hopes as they come of age. And I ask the question of, how do these women, as they are on the cusp of union formation and transition into parenthood, how do these women centering their own experience, narrate their preference for offspring sex, and what are the meanings that they themselves attach to sons versus daughters. So for this project, and to really understand people's meaning-making process, I relied on qualitative data. And these data come from my larger project on China's ending of the one-child policy. And between 2016 and 2017, I completed 115 original in-depth interviews in 2 metropolitan areas. And those interviews are of 45 men and 70 women. And today I'm going to just draw on the data from the 70 female interviews. And I relied on snowballing to reach my potential respondents and to eliminate to also, given the design of a small n sample, I also imposed strict sample selection criteria, meaning that for a small n design, if there are too much variability in each of the cells, each cell becomes so small to reliably identify themes and make conclusions. So to qualify for the study, a respondent has to be between ages 22 and 38. The age category was set up in a way that all of the respondents are born after 1978, which was one of the China's market reform. And all respondents are heterosexual identifying, and they have all completed some form of tertiary education. And for all the married couples, which I will show their demographic composition in a minute, they are not in union with each other. And I'm happy to talk more about the design and what have done with these data in Q&As. So, to avoid excessive clustering of the final sample, I also limited the seeds in the referral chains. So how many additional referrals each seed can give. And interviews were stopped when data saturation was reached, meaning that no new salient themes emerged with each additional interview. So this is what the qualitative sample looked like. So there are 45 men and 70 women. And the interview sample covered individuals of 3 life course stages. So there are the never married individuals and the married individuals in their first marriage. And for the respondents in their first marriage, they're also divided between those who have no children, no biological children, and those who have only 1 biological child. So the goal was the overarching larger project was also to study transition to second birth under China's relaxed maritime policy. So the qualitative interview protocol covered a wide range of questions on individuals' day-to-day life at home and at work. So we talked about their transition into marriage, for their dating history and marriage timing, and we also talked about their transition into childbearing. And the interview protocol covered extensively on individuals' work life and family life. So we talked, for example, about their job search experience, their workplace routines, the work-family friendly policies at their workplace, but also their household routines. So both the rhythm at work and the rhythm at home. And also the interview protocol adopted the word value survey gender module and incorporated those statements. So I read out, after reading out each statement to the respondents, I then asked them, how they, their reasoning underlying their stated agreement or disagreement with each statement. So the goal really is to situate individuals' experience, their ideations and beliefs about various aspects of family, marriage, and childbearing lives within what they see as their appropriate rights and roles and the division of labor between women and men. So for the purpose of this paper, or for the purpose of this project, I focused on their attitudes toward offspring sex and the meanings they attributed to having a daughter versus having a son. So after asking about their sex preference, I then probed into a respondent's reasoning for her stated sex preference and what having a son and having a daughter means to her. And specifically, I highlighted in the questions, I highlighted what is the perceived gains and losses associated with having a son versus having a daughter. But I also tried to situate into each respondent's own sex preference attitudes within the broader expectations that they face from other family members. So I also asked about the anticipated reactions toward the child's sex from other family members, particularly when applicable, husband, their own parents, and their parents-in-laws. So together, the goal is really to paint a holistic picture of individuals' meaning-making surround offspring sex in relation to their gendered lived experiences, both at home and beyond, but also within their deeply held gender-related beliefs, their ideas about division of labor and women's versus men's rights and roles and entitlements. So the data was collected in 2016 and 2017 using a combination of phone-based and face-to-face interviews. So with consent and in compliance with the IRB protocol, the data are recorded. So during the data analysis process, I listened to the recordings multiple times and coded transcriptions, and in so doing, write analytical memos and identified the themes inductively that is emerging from the data. So what are some of the logics that those individuals among highly educated urban Chinese women, what are their narratives and what are their meaning making surrounding some preference? So I'm going to introduce you to a few respondents, but please keep in mind that these are by no means singular examples. Rather, the quotes that I show today are reflect the prevailing themes in the qualitative data. So those are not singular occurrence or singular examples. So Ranyi, she is a 26-year-old woman who has never been married. Ranyi works as a market analyst and have a very long and grueling work schedule. And when I asked about her, when we were talking about gender attitudes, and Ranyi strongly believed that women and men should have equal rights to jobs. She strongly disagreed with the statement that when jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women's. And Ranyi also believed boys and girls equal rights to tertiary education, and she believed that men and women make equally good business executives and political leaders. Yet, when the topic arrived to son preference, Ranyi was adamant that she only wanted to have sons. And according to her, she drew on her own experience growing up, stating that I was mistreated by my grandparents who value boys, but not girls. But I still only want to have sons in the future. Because from experience, I know that a woman has to face a lot of hardship in this world. So for my children, for my future children, I don't want them to have to go through any of this. And Ranyi was not alone in thinking about her future children's success through the lens of what her own encounters or what her own lived experiences was. So Nana, who is a 28-year-old woman, also never married. Nana came from a privileged family, and she was educated abroad and now returned to one of the cities and worked in a philanthropical NGOs. And when I asked, and again, like Ranyi, Nana similarly believed in gender egalitarianism, adamantly supporting women's equal right, both in higher education, at work, and believing that men and women make equally good business executives, political leaders, and strongly disagreed with the idea that men should be the breadwinners while women be the caregivers. Yet again, when we talk to when the topic veered to son preference, Nana similarly stated that I really only hope to have boys because men are so advantaged in our society. I still wish I could be a man. So naturally I ask, well, advantaged how? And Nana very poignantly stated, well, one obvious aspect is men's advantages in getting hired and at the workplace. Our society holds different expectations for men and for women. It is just more freeing to be a man, especially for someone like me, who is not obedient or doesn't want to just focus on caring for the family. Men are given so much more freedom. So again, in these narratives and quotes, these women again draw on their own experience, encounters with both implicit but also overt discriminations in trying to frame what they wish for their children. And so for those women who are never married and childless, perhaps having a child is more distant into the future. And this reasoning, this idea of sparing their own child of gendered hardship becomes more visceral as women who are married, but without children describe what they wish for their offspring sex. So Bai is a 28-year-old woman married without children, but currently at the time of the interview, actively trying to conceive. And Bai was graduated from one of China's elite universities and currently work as an editor at a well-regarded publishing house. So to Bai, she said, I prefer to have a son and I hope for a son. And the reasoning she gave was both deeply personal and poignant, but at the same time visceral. And she said, by the look of it, it's unlikely that my husband and I would produce that an attractive child. And the physical appearance doesn't matter as much for a boy, but for a girl to be not good looking, I was an overweight kid. I started putting on weight while in middle school. So I really know how tormenting it can be when a girl is not good looking. being constantly mocked by others. And she concluded by saying, to have a daughter and for my own child to go through that, it would be too sad. So when we look at sex preference attitudes among those childless women, the model category is preferring son only. And especially we see that the preference for exclusive sons also very salient among these highly educated women who otherwise support gender egalitarianism. So it's not that these women believe or bought into the idea of male primacy. Rather, to these women, they articulated their preference for exclusive sons at the same time or simultaneously with their deeply held gender beliefs about women's and men's equal rights at work and in public spheres. And as these women describe what they wished for their offspring sex, they also took great care in drawing a moral or a symbolic boundary between themselves and who they deem as those people who value boys but not girls. Rather, to these women, they draw their own experiences of gender injustice, using that and using the narrative of sparing their own children from those gendered hardship as a way to frame their preference for offspring sex. As they expressed their preference for sons, there's very, very little or mention of the economic and the cultural benefits of having sons. But rather, using these narratives of gendered hardship, they are able to reconcile their beliefs in gender egalitarianism at one hand and the exclusive preference for sons on the other. So one may rightly question, what are the significance of this? And here we turn to the second logic of underlying the preference for male offspring among women, highly educated women who otherwise support gender egalitarianism. So Mo Fei is a 29-year-old woman, and she has been married for 4 years, but currently has no child. Mo Fei and her husband are both in the process of trying to conceive again. And when asked about Mo Fei's sex preference for offspring, Mo Fei wanted sons only. And she said, it's much easier to raise a boy. A daughter requires a lot more caution on the parents' part. So I asked, caution like what? She said, for example, when a daughter grows up and begins to have romantic relationship, you have to be mindful and make sure she knows how to prevent herself from being taken sexual advantage of. So a girl needs to face a lot of hardship. And she went on to list out what she believed were those hardships. She has to bear a child, and at some point, and during that time, her own career will surely suffer. And what if she just doesn't want to get married? A woman will be pressured much more for not marrying. Then, as her parent, you have to shield her from this pressure and tell her, while it's okay to be unmarried, be prepared about what's going to happen next. So for those highly educated women, drawing on their own experience and encounters with gender discrimination, both at home and beyond, they highlighted this gendered hardship and correspondingly viewed raising daughters as emotionally taxing hard work, which raising son will shield the parents from. And their views are echoed in interviews with mothers, especially mothers who currently have daughters. So Shali is 35 years old, a 35-year-old woman. She's married with a 4-year-old daughter. Shali runs her own startup and was very adamant about instilling the belief of gender egalitarianism in her daughters. Yet when we were talking about her childhood experience, Shali was stressed. And she said, there is a lot more to worry about when you have a daughter, especially about her safety in the world. You just have to worry a lot. And I asked her if she can give me some examples. And Shali said, I came across news reportings about little girls being abused in daycare. At the time of the interview and soon after, there were also high profile about kindergarten abuse cases, which permeated some respondents' thinking and discussions about their childbearing intentions. So Charlie continued to say, something similar happened in a kindergarten not far away from our apartment complex, and a male guard hurt a girl. So to Charlie, those things that a mother has to contend about raising daughters are emotionally taxing, and a lot of unmarried childless and married childless women project that and envision raising daughters as this emotionally taxing work that are rooted in the gendered hardship that women have to encounter in contemporary Chinese societies. And those two logics, the idea of the logics of the gendered hardship and the logics of gendered hard work undergird their preference for exclusive male offsprings. So again, Charlie said, all these really makes mothers of daughters anxious. So in other words, to these highly educated urban Chinese women who otherwise support gender egalitarianism, to some extent raising what having sons versus having daughters means, unlike accent studies that highlighted the cultural and economic values of sons versus daughters, really these women are not thinking in the terms of what the sons or daughters can do for their parents, but rather what a mother can or cannot do for their child. So what are some of the behavioral implications? And one may also rightly question, how does familial expectation figure into these women's sex preference attitudes? So turning to the sex preference attitudes among mothers. If you remember Morphe, whom I just introduced, she cited, the gendered hardship, but also what mothers can or cannot do for her child when she was describing her own preference for male offspring. And as our conversation progressed, her answers became more and more candid. And she said, my husband and I are also completely in agreement that we both wanted a boy. So I asked, what is your husband's reasoning or attitudes or the reasoning for wanting a boy? Morphe said he just wants to have a son so much. He even said that if my first child were a daughter, I should spend my postpartum month at my natal home. He really just doesn't like girls, doesn't even want to look at her if it's a girl. So to some extent, despite the nuance in their reasoning, the gendered hardship and gendered hard work, those preference or those attitudes toward male offspring ultimately also does not challenge the existing preference for sons within the patriarchal family system. So when looking at the mothers in the sample, the mothers who intend to have a second child are those whose firstborn is a daughter, while at the same time there exists a preference for sons on the husband's side, but either from the husband or from the husband and the parents-in-laws. And those patterns that we see are quite consistent with quantitative studies on China's sex ratio at birth, which shows an even more skewed and heightened sex ratio at birth at a higher order, at higher parity. So for example, in Wu Yang, who is a 34-year-old mother with a 10-year-old daughter, and Wu Yang and her husband are actively trying to conceive at the time of the interview. And when I asked about Wu Yang, what are her hopes for the second child, and she said the sex of the child doesn't matter for the first one, either a boy or a girl is fine. For the second one though, we want a boy. And to Wu Yang, it's the first one. If you're not happy with it, you can try again. So again, that's something that we have seen in existent in excellent studies on China's sex ratio at birth, showing that the number becomes more skewed at parity 2 and even more so at parity 3. So what are some of the implications that I want to discuss? So on one hand, recent sociological studies have highlighted how modernizations has transformed the meaning of children and childhood. So in her landmark study, Zelizer had demonstrated that industrialization have given rise to the sentimentalization of childhood. So children's no longer valued for their economic potentials have increasingly become economically useless, but emotionally priceless. And the research on China has similarly documented that how children have become precious, especially urban children under the one-child policy as a result of China's socioeconomic transformations as well. So the findings of this project, to some extent, are consistent with this trend. So utilizing the logics of gendered hardship and gendered hard work, highly educated urban Chinese women articulated their sex preference attitudes not through evaluating the utilitarian values of a boy vis-a-vis a girl, but rather through envisioning what parents can or cannot do for the priceless child. However, at the same time, with the changing meaning of children and childhood, also came intensified parental investment into children. So to that end, scholars have thought about whether child rearing can serve as a disruptor or can be a mechanism for social change by sensitizing parents to the issues of gender inequality. So, for example, drawing on evidence from the United States, scholars showed that, fathers with only sons show the least amount support for policies promoting gender equity. So those scholars argue that, wanting what's best for their own child may keep men from challenging the patriarchal dividend. And the findings of this project provides a mirror image of sorts. So invoking their own experiences of gender discrimination, of the gendered hardship, highly educated urban Chinese women also formulated their own son preference attitudes as the desire to shield their children from gendered hardship, while enabling them to enjoy gendered privileges. So despite their acute awareness of gender inequality and their beliefs in gender egalitarianism, such a preference and desire for male offspring ultimately does not disrupt the existing gender inequality within the patriarchal order of contemporary China. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions and discussions.
Thank you, Yan. It was fantastic, really fascinating. Do we have, so we can open the floor to questions. You can unmute or post a question through chat or raise your hand, whatever you like. So yeah, and I guess I have one question I can lead off with as people gather their thoughts. And I guess it's not even so much a question, it's just something that was really striking to me in one of the quotes you presented was that one of your respondents said that she and her husband were in complete agreement about wanting a son. But then his reason was that he couldn't stand the idea of having a daughter. So it seems like the reasoning for their agreement was completely different. And so I'm wondering how much information you got from your interviews about how couples negotiated probably their underlying disagreements. I'm imagining their different views on gender egalitarianism that manifested as a shared preference for sons.
Yeah, thank you, Paula. That's a fast. Yeah, so she was one of the examples where the husband really wanted a son. And would go to such extreme saying, if you have a daughter, I don't want to see you. But then there are other respondents who similarly expressed their own son preference in the language of hardship and hard work. Whereas if you then ask about her her husband and her parents-in-law, it's still very much, we want a son so that we can keep the family line. And then there are also respondents who ended up actually having sons, but they themselves prefer daughters. And in those cases, we don't see any second birth transition intention. So the idea is that one of the respondents, her husband told her, having a son, this is something that will bring happiness to everyone in the family, maybe not you, but everyone else. So this is what we're gonna stop at. So I think for those women, especially those women who wanted to have daughters, but ended up having sons, and their idea or their second, so when they talk about their second birth transition intention, they frequently highlighted the cost of having the son being able to marry. So making sure that those children, their son receive the concentrated family resources in trying to. So it's, to me, it's, I'm kind of still developing this paper in thinking about what is a bigger sociological case that it can make off from these respondents. To me, it's, the gender logics in a different directions that is still kind of, despite what these women say, it still end up from different angles re-entrenching the deeply gender essentialist economic and social and familial arrangements of contemporary China. And those economic, social, and gendered arrangement have also been entrenched or have been sort of deepened after the market reform. So I'm trying to connect this to that piece of state and market, those forces. But that's so something I'm trying to keep working on this paper.
Okay, thanks. So it looks like lots of people have gotten in line with questions. Sarah?
Great talk. It's very, very compelling, and I'm going to recommend this talk after it goes up on YouTube to my class, my sociology class, because we were just starting to get into some of these complexities, and I think that you've laid out so beautifully how difficult it is to think about change when you have an entrenched system of lineage and culture plus economic development and all of these pieces. I thought you did a fantastic job of laying that all out in its complexity. I guess my question was, I would love to hear your thoughts on the implications of studying two metropolitan areas, and I believe the sample was highly educated folks. So do you feel like if you spoke with folks outside of metro areas and in perhaps less privileged households, you would get a similar thing? Do you think that highly educated women have had to find other ways to explain and legitimate sort of choices that they make, or do you think that all women in China and in other places that are facing son preference regimes are recognizing and having to grapple with the human rights aspects versus the sort of realities of their economic situation, of lineage, of grandparents, all of those pieces? So I guess my question is really about, how does speaking to more highly educated women, or does it influence kind of the results you got, and whether there's heterogeneity across the population that you would, if you could speak to?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think that's a lot to chew on. To me, what I find quite interesting is the recent studies on sex preference in China that came out of doing ethnographic work in rural China.
Yep.
Typically highlight, a shift toward daughter preference by saying that daughters are, the little quilted vest that warms parents' heart, or daughters provide emotional values that sons do not necessarily provide. Whereas if we switch to urban China, especially highly educated women in metropolitan areas, we see this idea of, wanting to ensure their offspring can carry on having some advantage as they grow up. So I wonder, or to me, it also seemed like a case of the the understanding of social mobility. So for those urban folks, it's the idea of making sure their children can continue to enjoy the advantage that they can enjoy. And by having sons, it's not just class advantage or urban advantage, but also gender privilege that come into this piece as well. So to me, it seemed that to these highly educated urban women, their son preference is part of their overarching narrative about child rearing as a project or as a way to ensure upward mobility, or at least to keep their children from downward mobility. I think that to me seemed to be part of their sort of understanding as they think about sound preference. And I also thought about, a parallel between some of the studies on Vietnam in 1990s about also it's the highly educated women there wanting to have sons. And female education has and those are the women who associate having sons with being able to use certain modern technology, and it becomes sex selection becomes also a technology / modernization / development project for that are reflected in families. So to me, I think as I think about it, I really want to make a kind of bigger case from these quotes and trying to think about the connections to that. So thank you so much. That gives me a lot to think about.
Thanks, fantastic.
Yeah.
Hi. So that was so interesting. It definitely made me think about things in my own family too. I have an aunt who has a lesbian daughter, and she's like, well, I don't have a problem with lesbians, but I know that other people are homophobic, and so her life will be more difficult. So that's why I wasn't really cool with having a lesbian daughter at the beginning. So I think of situations like that, where it seems to be kind of this like response desirability bias issue on one hand, but then there's also, there's a lot of research in domestic US, right, where people think that their neighbors are more like racist or sexist than they actually are, but everyone has this impression, and that's driving everyone's behavior. So there are all these different ways in which this pattern of response could occur, right? And I'm just wondering what in your data you can leverage to think about how much is this response to desirability bias, how much is this urban educated women like being embedded in a social context in which they don't realize how many other women feel the same way they do, and if they all realize they felt the same way, maybe they wouldn't think that the world around them is as sexist. How much of this is about kind of like the age structure, and that because they're kind of the vanguard of women having a different role in society, that if you like break up your sample in half to like the older women versus the younger women, you would see a difference. Like there are so many different things I think could be driving this pattern. And so I'm just wondering, like, and they could all be happening at once. So maybe they're distinguishing between them isn't possible or useful, but these are the kinds of questions I was thinking about as I was listening to you talk.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. Exactly. So as I was thinking about desirability bias, and one way that I kind of shielded myself a little from that is when I was looking through the entire transcripts, people say things that you think it's undesirable. So for example, there are, so Charlie, one of the example I gave, Charlie, who is a mother to a younger daughter, and she has her startup, and she's very adamant wanting to raise a strong daughter. But then in another breath, and she said, oh, I'm not going to hire any woman for my startup because it's just so much trouble hiring women, and you have to contend with their maternity leaves. And I had this woman who is highly qualified, but then she's going to get pregnant, so I'm not hiring her. So so there's also kind of those cases where I I thought to myself, okay, the reason they gave me probably is quite candid, reflecting what they believe. But then, of course, and there's also the difference between what people say and how they behave. And so this paper, and I can share that, it was recently rejected by China Quarterly. And one of the reviewer comments was that, these women who say they prefer songs, are they going to go to the same stream as what we have seen in studies from 1980s, 1990s, who are these also the women who are going to go to the extreme of actually aborting a female fetus if they find out they are pregnant with a daughter? And the answer is probably unlikely, given the sample. So that's also, what I want to make what I want to sort of frame this as a bigger case of something sociologically something. And to the question of how the other ways to separate the samples, one way that I have kind of look at the sample is the 70 women here are about 2/3 of them are, if we look at their word value survey responses, are overwhelmingly what would we call gender egalitarian, whereas the rest are, what we would call, women who are deeply held gender essentialist beliefs. And we see some variations there, but those variations, but the more salient variation there actually has to do with their attitude toward one-child policy. It's often though women who are very gender egalitarian have a stronger support for one-child policy, seeing themselves as the beneficiaries of the policies. And on some preference, there aren't much variations per se, but also it's a smaller sample. But on some preference, for these women, the most striking thing to me is the ones who are very gender egalitarian, strikingly, are also the ones who would exclusively prefer songs. I hope that answers some of the questions, but yeah, I agree with you. Given the sample structures, there are a lot of things that can drive the patterns that we see here.
King Xuan?
Oh, yeah, hi. Okay. Okay, thank you for the wonderful presentation. I am in your study. I think it's very interesting that women with higher education have some preference, not because they really like song, but because they are more worried about what their daughter will encounter in a country with gender inequality. So what I'm curious about is that while these like a highly educated woman have some preference, does they really will have an abortion or do any sex selection because of the children's sex? So what I think is that if they don't really take an action, if they just only have those intentions in their mind and they don't really take any action, maybe so maybe it's such some preference in highly educated women have little effect on the remaining the traditional gender preference, something like that. So I'm curious your opinion about this issue.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Thank you so much for that. That's a very astute observation. And as I said, exactly what would be the behavioral implications for this? My intuition right now is maybe, and it's very unlikely they will go to the extreme extent toward which we have seen in other research focused on different demographics, but I do think it has deep implications for second birth. So so on one end, that these are the women who, despite their nuance, their preference to some extent does not challenge, but rather confirm to the more patriarchal expectations of having sons. And I do see in the data that the women who tend to have a second birth are the ones with daughters, and the ones who, but their parents-in-laws and husband, really wanted to have a son. So we will see that. We'll kind of see that, and also I think this is also confirmed by some of the national data released after the 2016 universal two-child policy went into effect. And we see that a lot of the women who who went to have a second child are the women who are slightly older in their reproductive age, so that they were actually so they were part of the, so they aren't able to have a second birth under the one-child policy, but then for those are the slightly older women, slightly older in their reproductive age, but also with a firstborn daughter. So I wouldn't think, and that also it's consistent with just the overarching kind of the demographic data we see in China, is that sex ratio at birth are relatively more or less normal for first birth, but then it gets really, really skewed at second birth. So Wu Yang, the one respondent I show, she wasn't completely, and she's only the one case, but I'm aware for that. So she was trying to conceive, and it seemed that she has been trying to conceive over the last several years, and she was very adamant about having a son this time. So she wasn't very forthright about, you know, what really went through. But my intuition would be that it will have a actual behavioral implications for second birth. Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you.
And Erin.
Yeah, thank you, Yoon. This is very interesting. I was curious to hear more about the role of old age care and how much these women were projecting into their own age to imagine what would be, you know, how they would be cared for when they were older, and also how many of them had older parents who had reached a point themselves who needed care, and how they were, like, how much of a kind of rupture between the way they imagined their own role with their parents was different from the way they imagined their children's role with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Erin. Great. So for those urban individuals, the China's pension support is relatively, so China's pension support has a strong rural-urban divide, whereas urban residents are entitled to state-provided pension that are not available to rural respondents or rural residents. So for a lot of research on rural China, old age support was really sort of the crux of the issue, given the lack of state support. But for rural residents, there are relatively more generous, but not that generous state support. And also that's kind of in crisis now with China's deficit in pension fund. So for these respondents, they are very aware that as only daughters, they are going to be the providers for their own parents alongside with their husbands. And they kind of, and I think that's where the only child piece comes in, is being the only child. It doesn't matter the gender, it's still you're the only hope for the parents. And as they think about their own kind of project into their own future, to me, what my intuition and from what I gather in the data is in those imaginaries or what they imagine the futures is really centered around what they can do for their children and making sure their children don't slip down the socioeconomic ladders. So to me, there's also a lot of the moral connotations surrounded about that, which I think is a feature of the class structure and the market state kind of dynamics in urban China after the reform, is sort of thinking that to be a worthy, to be eligible, to be a person deserving of having child, you have to be someone who are able to provide. So those also come up in their narratives in general about having children. Is they draw a boundary also between the deserving and undeserving people who can be parents, and undeserving are the poor who cannot provide. So again, it's a very child-centered logic there, which we see similarly in the preference for some preference. So I think to me, my goal for this project would be that at some point to kind of think of, using some preference as a case to also speak something more about the morals of child rearing and the politics of child rearing. Yeah, thank you so much. Fantastic questions.
Hey, thank you. That was terrific. It was a great discussion following your talk. So we'll just use, again, the last 10 or 15 minutes here for a chance for you to talk with our trainees. So I will thank our faculty and other attendees for joining, and I'll stop the recording now.